With likely ICBM capabilities, the ability to miniaturize, and up to 60 nuclear weapons, there is no doubt that North Korea is a nuclear state that can threaten the US and its allies, Japan and South Korea. It has steadily pursued this path for several decades, and US endeavors to convince North Korea to denuclearize have been wholly ineffective and show no signs of future success. Thus, it is high time that US officials reevaluate the extent to which pushing for denuclearization furthers the primary US interest in the region. This interest can be simply stated as creating stability in the region to limit the chances that tensions will escalate into conflict with the US or its allies. We will argue that supporters of the current US policy are wrong in believing that they can only achieve stability by pressuring North Korea to denuclearize, and rather that the current measures are in fact counterproductive. Just as these policymakers view Kim's production of nuclear weapons as inherently aggressive, Kim views pressure tactics as attempts to undermine the security that nuclear weapons bring to his regime. In this way, a pressure strategy only increases Kim's perceived need for nuclear weapons. Simultaneously, it increases the likelihood of inadvertent escalation, as both sides see the other's actions as aggressive. Therefore, our proposal is that we should instead pursue a strategy of multilateral de-escalation and rebalancing, in which the US attempts to alleviate Kim's security anxiety as a means to achieve the US interest of stability in the region, while simultaneously not compromising the US's deterrence capabilities. And, as the end goal of this strategy, in return for the easing of pressure on all fronts, as well as the introduction of strategic benefits, we will demand that North Korea sign a binding agreement to indefinitely freeze its nuclear program and allow for verification of this freeze. As previously referenced, the argument that supporters of the non-negotiable denuclearization approach would make against this proposal is that a nuclear Kim is not containable, and that therefore any strategy that reduces pressure without denuclearization will allow the Kim regime to go unchallenged in gaining leverage and ultimately expanding. However, this view ignores the concept of self-preservation that is at the core of the Kim regime. This is significant for multiple reasons. Not only has this been the guiding principle allowing the Kim dynasty to maintain power, it is the mechanism through which the current regime gains internal legitimacy. Thus, to the extent that Kim's nuclear weapons are an extension of the self-preservation concept, intended as crucial means for deterrence, Kim knows that his regime will collapse from within if he gives them up. Thus, for Kim, denuclearization is not an option. At the same time, this principle is the precise reason that Kim would not use his nuclear weapons, let alone attempt expansion, unless he felt that without doing so there was a higher chance that his regime would be destroyed. He is aware of US military capabilities and knows that if he were to strike first against the US or its allies, that his regime would almost certainly be destroyed. Still, denuclearization hardliners seem to believe that allowing Kim to keep his nuclear weapons would inevitably lead to conflict. Not only is this incorrect, however, this is dangerously counterproductive to US interests. The policy of ratcheting up pressure that this belief has justified is not just misguided, it greatly increases the likelihood of inadvertent escalation. Because Kim views his nuclear arsenal as a necessary means of deterrence, he views US attempts to get him to give up his nuclear weapons as attempts to dismantle his regime's security. Thus, as the US ratchets up pressure, Kim's security anxiety grows, as does his perception that he needs more nuclear weapons. In this way, the current approach of non-negotiable denuclearization creates a vicious cycle that, if continued, would likely end in devastating conflict. Clearly, this approach is unacceptable, and thus we propose that the US follows a 4-point plan to implement an agreement of multilateral de-escalation and rebalancing, in which, for several concessions on the part of the US, North Korea agrees to indefinitely freeze its nuclear testing and development program, and allow this freeze to be regularly verified by China and the IAEA. The first point in this plan would involve the US acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear state to lower the chance that Kim would attack the US or its allies by assuring him that the US does not mean to remove its defensive capabilities. This first step would serve as an important precursor to the following points for two reasons. It would both de-escalate tensions by legitimizing Kim's view of his nuclear weapons as a means of deterrence, and also emphasize that the reduction of pressure tactics is not an attempt to get Kim to give up his weapons. Second, we propose that the US stops all joint military exercises with South Korea to decrease the chance of escalation due to military pressure. In addition, the US would rebalance its military capabilities, including THAAD, such that they're positioning aids stability by lowering Kim's security anxiety while also allowing the US to ensure security for its allies in the extremely unlikely case that North Korea were to become aggressive following the implementation of this agreement. Third, this agreement would be implemented through a framework of multilateral talks. This would generally facilitate communication between North Korea and US allies, helping to ease tensions. It would also allow the US to make use of China's interest in the relocation of THAAD to incentivize it to play a leading role in the nuclear freeze verification process. Fourth and finally, the agreement would employ the de-escalatory rollback of pressure tactics through sanction removal. In concert with reducing economic pressure, the US would increase trade relations and some forms of aid. This would incentivize cooperation by increasing North Korea's dependence on the agreement. Now, to talk more about the military aspect of our proposal, here's Nico Koloma-Cook.
Thank you, Forrest. I'm Nico Koloma-Cook, the military expert in this region. North Korea is an increasing threat to United States security, yet our current military strategy only escalates instability in the region. Kim Jong-un sees the current U.S. troops in South Korea as a direct threat to his regime and is rapidly developing a nuclear arsenal in response to this danger he perceives. More aggressive military operations are completely nonsensical, as it is a clear gateway to Kim responding with extreme military measures. A more aggressive military strategy is a direct route that leads to U.S. preventive attacks, whether it be a ground troop insurgents or to topple the Kim regime, or an airstrike to destroy Kim's nuclear stockpile. These actions indicate to Kim that he must utilize anything in his power to preserve North Korea. This includes nuclear weapons more than 16 times as powerful as the hydrogen bomb on Hiroshima, along with ballistic and chemical weapons. The casualties would be catastrophic, with experts estimating tens of millions dead in South Korea, Japan, and the United States. It is evident that military operations less aggressive than the status quo must be implemented for future de-escalation in the region, and the most stable nuclear deterrence of North Korea. The most efficient military framework is a three-pronged approach involving a rebalance of current U.S. forces in the region, relocation of our defense systems, and an alteration of U.S. military exercises with South Korea. A rebalance of our ground troops stationed in South Korea is advantageous to the United States as it greatly strengthens relations with Japan and stabilizes the volatile tensions with North Korea. We intend to rebalance 14,250 of the 28,500 troops in South Korea to Marine Corps Air Station Iwakuni in Japan. 4,200 of these troops will be moved from U.S. Army Garrison Yongsan in Seoul, the closest U.S. base near the demilitarized zone, decreasing its personnel from 6,200 to 2,000. This sharp troop decline minimizes a potential offensive strategy by the U.S. in Kim's mind, thus greatly contributes to the United States' goal of a stable nuclear deterrence of the Kim regime. This rebalance will happen throughout a span of 3 to 5 years, allowing the U.S. to maintain positive relations with Moon and all of South Korea by not immediately pulling out troops, leaving them vulnerable to unlikely North Korean threats. If the United States were to withdraw all 28,500 troops from South Korea, security anxiety around the Korean Peninsula would spike within our allied nations, potentially causing South Korea and Japan to nuclearize. Thus, leaving 14,250 U.S. troops in South Korea effectively deters Moon and Abe from nuclearization. After the full rebalance, there will be roughly 65,000 U.S. troops active in Japan, with the strongest reinforcements stationed in Marine Corps Air Station Iwakuni, allowing seamless access to South Korea if Kim were to instigate any future act of aggression. Coupled with this increase in troops, the U.S. will utilize its Cold War strategy with Japan by sending submarines with missile capabilities into U.S. military bases sporadically to further reassure Japan of its deterrence umbrella. An option for permanent missile-capable U.S. submarines to be stationed in Japan on various bases is allowed within this rebalancing military strategy, but would only be utilized if future tensions skyrocketed in the Korean Peninsula. The second major military action is to relocate U.S. THAAD installations in South Korea, which are currently just outside of Seoul, to Naval Base Guam. This benefits U.S. security yet again, because China will view this as a clear decline in U.S. encroachment on their military bases within their nation. This creates a strong foundation for a positive relationship with this superpower in this region and allows the United States to easily initiate talks of cooperation strategies with China regarding further North Korean nuclear deterrence. Along with this relocation being politically advantageous, it is geographically efficient as well, because the United States could easily reinstall THAAD back into South Korea if North Korea were to pose an immediate security threat in any future situation. Thirdly, U.S.-South Korean joint military exercises have been halted as of last month, resulting from the Singapore summit. And for continued de-escalation, an official freeze of any further U.S.-South Korean military exercises will be implemented. These military exercises are counterproductive to the main current U.S. focus of security, as they clearly spike tensions annually between the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea. It is unacceptable to continue military exercises such as Full Eagle or Max Thunder, in which the United States flies F-16 fighter jets across the demilitarized zone, solely on the basis that these exercises are military traditions and have been carried out for decades. Instead of wasting military funds every year, a promise by the U.S. to stop these exercises, coupled with the 4,200 troop decrease, as previously stated, in our military base in Seoul, positions the United States to successfully impose stable deterrence of North Korea's nuclear arsenal, as Kim's perceived safety threat, sparked by his thoughts of U.S. encroachment, is removed. In return for the culmination of all of these military actions, we will demand that North Korea freeze any further development of their nuclear arsenal indefinitely. Non-aggressive military actions by the United States in this region is undoubtedly the most efficient strategy to fully deter North Korea from its nuclear pursuits through its extremely low probability for future conflict and loss of lives. Avoiding conflict and easing tensions are major goals for the U.S. that an aggressive military scaffolding could easily lead to an airstrike or ground troop insurgents fails to accomplish. Lastly, an open up to negotiations regarding an official peace treaty to end the Korean War will be initiated, lowering tensions between Kim and the U.S. yet again. I will now turn it over to our regional expert, Chandler Pettigrew, to expand further on the status of this region's allies and its combatants.
Thank you, Nico. My name is Chandler Pettigrew, and I will be focusing on the regional aspect of our policy. Rather than pursuing maximum pressure, the U.S. should create overlapping multilateral and bilateral ties that links us to our allies in China in order to achieve de-escalation. We should encourage states to act in their own self-interest and focus on establishing a web of relations in the Asia-Pacific to handle North Korea. This will reassure Kim and create a stable diplomatic deterrence policy that will restrain a nuclear North Korea and be in the best interest of the U.S. A web of relations, as I described, is a network of multilateral and bilateral ties that would increase stability in a region. Creating a web of relations in regards to North Korea would be in the U.S. best interest because it creates four main positive outcomes. And they would be 1, stability in the region; 2, avoid provoking China; 3, avoid further nuclear proliferation; and 4, avoid overextension in the region. Stability in the region can help avoid further military escalation, which would put our allies South Korea and Japan at risk. And these in turn would, feeling as if their security concerns were at risk, would help cause them perhaps to consider nuclear weapons, which we will want to avoid, primarily to avoid provoking China. And also having China in the equation will help us realize the fact that as Asia Pacific becomes a more and more bipolar world, that America wants to work with China to collaborate and cooperate on certain issues, such as the North Korean nuclear crisis. And also, we want these different states to actually step up and take initiative in the region so we can avoid overextension. Previously, the United States attempted multilateral talks to handle North Korean nuclear crisis through the original six-party talks. The original six-party talks took place from 2003 to 2009, and many consider the original six-party talks to be a failure. The United States went into these talks with the goal of complete denuclearization of North Korea, which unfortunately did not happen, but however, there's for many different reasons. 1, the United States felt the need to dominate the conversation and did not listen to other proposals by China and South Korea, such as having a step-by-step plan for denuclearization or a freeze-for-freeze plan. And also, the United States prolonged debates about denuclearization, talking about what it would entail, what they would not negotiate on, versus focusing on what both and all parties could agree on. And also, the talks were sidelined by other concerns, such as the Japanese adoptees taken by North Korean forces in the 1970s and 80s. Therefore, as I said again, many consider these talks to be a failure, and they also did not prevent North Korea from its first nuclear test in 2006. Today, the current policy is maximum pressure, and many argue that it is successfully bringing North Korea to the negotiation table. However, this ignores how vague these agreements have been, and North Korea's unwillingness to denuclearize. Regarding the Singapore summit that happened just last month, many consider it to be a diplomatic success. For one, we got North Korea to actually promise to denuclearize. However, this ignores the fact that the agreement itself lacks certain guidelines, any specifics, or a timeline for this process of denuclearization. And also, in the past, North Korea has agreed to denuclearize or be on the process or path of denuclearization, but it has not occurred. And this is because North Korea ties its security to nuclear weapons. And just earlier this month, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went to North Korea to further discuss denuclearization. And while he publicly stated he felt as if the talks were a success, North Korean press actually considered those talks to actually be gangster-like in terms of U.S. demands, and actually criticized the U.S. for trying to impose unilateral pressure for denuclearization. Therefore, rather than imposing denuclearization on North Korea or maximum pressure, we impose multilateral talks that rely on our allies in China. Rather than resuming the six-party talks as they were, we want to have a new framework for a web of relations. While it will include the original parties, we will have more of a free discussion that will allow for bilateral agreements and also for other countries to take initiatives, particularly South Korea and China. And also, we will have a freeze-for-freeze plan that will entail that we will stop military exercises and roll back sanctions as North Korea freezes the development and testing of its nuclear weapons. And this, in turn, would increase stability in the region. One, because we realize that the nuclear stockpile is not increasing. Therefore, we can focus on seeing what nuclear weapons and stockpiles are in North Korea. And also will help start a process towards, hopefully, eventual denuclearization, maybe perhaps in the future. And also, we would want to focus on a verification process that also actively involves China. Due to China's vested interest in keeping the Kim regime afloat, due to the fact that they fear a humanitarian crisis on the North Korean and Chinese border, China will be willing to make concessions and be actively engaged in these talks. And also, as it realizes that it might want to have further collaboration with the United States on other issues, such as the South China Sea, it will help facilitate a network that will be able to establish other establish solutions for other problems. And also, in regarding our allies, South Korea and Japan, South Korean President Moon Jae-in has publicly advocated for peace on the Korean Peninsula, and has also publicly stated that he views inter-Korean dialogue and communication as central to avoiding escalation on the Korean Peninsula. And so therefore, the United States should encourage South Korea to pursue bilateral talks, such as happened in the Sunshine Policy under President Kim Dae-jung, that was implemented in 1998. And also regarding Japan, while Japan initially was far more hardline towards North Korea, Japan also realizes that it depends heavily on its allies to be able to have diplomatic and economic ties with North Korea. And without its allies, it wouldn't be able to talk about other issues such as I mentioned before, the Japanese adoptees that were taken. Therefore, overall, we want to create these ties and networks that can not only be used for the North Korean crisis, but also for further issues diplomatically and economically. And now I would like to welcome our economic expert, Hadika.
Hello, my name is Hadika, and today I will be discussing why a non-aggressive economic policy would be our best policy option in terms of economic engagement with North Korea. Millions of dollars worth in sanctions over the last 11 years have consistently failed in preventing North Korea from denuclearizing. Starting from 2006, when North Korea only possessed one nuclear reactor with a capability to enrich plutonium, North Korea has significantly progressed to last year carrying out its largest nuclear test. North Korea has always been impervious to aggressive economic policies, which it views as a threat to its survival. This not only adds to instability in the region, but is also counterproductive to U.S. security concerns and policy interests in the region. So today we advocate for a more non-aggressive economic policy, allowing North Korea to access international financing systems and integrating North Korea's economy into global markets. However, our policy prescriptions aim to be highly conditioned upon security and economic concessions made on North Korea's part. Okay. So before I get into what our policy would entail, I will be briefly discussing why maximum pressure would not be conducive to U.S. interests in the region for a few critical reasons. Primarily, it would lead to inadvertent escalation of conflict, because economic pressures add to the urgency for more nuclear arsenal because they're perceived as an offensive stance of the international community towards North Korea. And as we've seen from past experiences, that North Korea has only escalated with increasing intensity of sanctions. And we cannot risk lives of hundreds of thousands of people by pursuing a strategy that time and time again failed over the past 11 years. Secondly, North Korea is a very unique case in terms of how its economy is structured. While it relies heavily on international markets for procurement of their nuclear technology and nuclear equipment, their internal economy remains significantly isolated from international influence. Unlike Iran or Russia, which can be pressurized economically through sanctions because it hurts them, North Korea is mostly sheltered from such economic pressure. So not only is a greater economic pressure a risk to the United States security concerns, but also a waste of time and money. Finally, and most importantly, at least in terms of being counterproductive to U.S. economic interests in the region, increased isolation of North Korea by the U.S. pushes them into China and Russia's corner. China not only fears escalation, but has over and over again refused to impose oil embargoes on North Korean oil. It's, as Chandler pointed out earlier, it's because they fear escalation and they fear regime change would lead to a refugee crisis at their borders. On the other hand, Russia has always exploited sanctions imposed by the United States by increasing their trade with North Korea to increase their legitimacy in the region. And by isolating North Korea, we would be further pushing North Korea into China and Russia's corner, and especially in light of the escalating trade wars, that would be extremely counterproductive to the United States' economic interests in the region. So what would our policy entail? So our policy can be fundamentally divided into 3 tiers. Firstly, we would ease off on unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States. This would particularly include easing off on labor exports, easing off on the cap on remittances, and allowing North Korea to export its coal, minerals, and electronics, some of North Korea's major export goods. This would not only reduce urgency, but also minimize opportunity for escalation by reassuring Kim that the United States does not hold an offensive stance against it being a nuclear state. Secondly, we would remove secondary sanctions on China, because not only would this improve relationship with China, but also gain China's support for efforts to contain North Korea. This will happen because China shares United States' fear of escalation, and they have a vested interest in containing North Korea without any risk of an escalated nuclear war. Lastly, we would provide North Korea with food, agricultural, and textile aid, and this would give them greater economic opportunities, so they derive greater incentives from more economic engagement with the United States than from possessing nuclear arsenal. And this is not entirely unprecedented. In 1999, North Korea agreed to stop its proliferation of nuclear technology to Iran in exchange for $1 billion offered by Israel. And so we have seen that economy and running a stable economy is also important to Kim regime's survival, which is why they would be willing to take up really great economic opportunities for fees on their nuclear arsenal. So our policy is a quid pro quo for certain conditions and demands that we ask and certain concessions that we would demand North Korea to make in return. So firstly, we would want North Korea to allow the U.S. to monitor all its economic activity and flow of finances. This would include U.S. Monitoring trade deals, incoming, outgoing cargo, and inspecting shipping vessels. North Korea, United States, and China will also keep track of government assets and assets of Kim's elites and other flow of finances running the economy. And lastly, United States would assist other trading partners of North Korea with inspection of illicit trade cargo. Okay, secondly, we would also impose smarter sanctions on North Korea. This would entail targeting key personnel like gateway firms or other tactical controllers and other shell and front companies that assist North Korea with developing with deploying their funds for nuclear equipment and gaining access to international markets. And we would also continue ban on trade arms, military equipment, transfer vehicles, and other dual-use materials. Finally, why would more economic engagement be our best policy option? Firstly, it's because we would be able to embed North Korea's economy into the international community, subjecting it to more rules and regulations, and thus increasing scrutiny of all economic activity that goes on inside the country. Over time, we would be tying their economy into global markets, increasing their dependence on their economic partners for their survival, and this would provide United States meaningful leverage over both China and North Korea in the region, allowing U.S. to not only be able to contain but also hurt North Korea in case they violate the agreement in the future, since the United States would have more access to their internal economic affairs. Finally, China and the United States would be better equipped to deal with illicit and private proliferation networks that assist North Korea in procurement of nuclear technology and military equipment, and moving their finances. And with, as we've discussed earlier, by my regional expert, why China would be on board with all of this, United States and China's resources together would be at a better and a stronger standpoint to deal with any violations of future agreements. Now I would like to hand it off to Forrest to conclude why a non-aggressive and de-escalatory policy would be our best policy option. Thank you.
Okay. Though this plan is much more realistic than the pressure to denuclearization plan currently being employed, or any hypothetical plan that includes more pressure, it is not guaranteed to work. While the likelihood is very low, there is still the possibility that interregional relations would become volatile, or that the Kim regime would violate the agreement, for example. However, even if the region is not able to maintain perfect stability, the implementation of this plan would limit the pathways for inadvertent escalation. Perhaps the most important in this regard is the concept of the web of relations. Even if the interests of the states involved in the multilateral talks change or prove incompatible in the future, this platform for communication would ensure that diplomacy, if possible, would be a first resort. Similarly, military rebalancing and military pressure reduction would make conflict less likely in the case of any minor kind of dispute or accident by decreasing the tension between the militaries. Furthermore, this would also allow the U.S. to ensure the security of its allies without Kim feeling as though that security was a direct threat to that of his regime. In this way, escalation due to the U.S. ally relationships would be much less likely, and rather than immediately preparing for conflict, allies would be able to use diplomacy with the assurance of security provided by the U.S. as a contingency plan. Finally, the benefits for the Kim regime of the integration of North Korea into economic relations with the U.S. would not only give the regime a strong incentive not to violate the agreement, it would set up a system of partial economic dependence, in which there would be much less room for escalation by conflict by virtue of illicit economic activity. Thus, overall, our policy is not only the most effective in that it facilitates regional stability, it also minimizes the pathways to escalation if something were to go wrong. Thank you.
Many thanks to Team A for their presentation. We start with our experts.
Well, thanks. I look at this, I see where you're going with your logic and, the intent, and I think you've given it a very forthright effort here. As we look at what our big concerns are, and those of our allies, concerned about North Korean first use of weapons, as I look at this framework, that's what I think is lacking. I think we address North Koreans' concerns, right? We're repositioning troops. We're withdrawing. We are stopping exercises. We're actually removing sanctions and helping them economically. So we're definitely affecting their mindset here to assuage any concerns they have of us using a first strike. But this framework really doesn't address ours. Have you thought about any creative ways where you may be able to do this, even under the framework that you're suggesting here? For example, what if I said that, and I would look for your analysis and thoughts on, what about a joint occupation of their nuclear sites? What if a UN element, we're not taking the weapons away from Kim, they're his weapons, but we want to have a joint occupation. China would play a key role in this UN force, US would as well. And the point being is that what we would get out of it is really addressing our concern that although his weapons, he wouldn't use them because we're jointly occupying the site, as an incentive that this would go along with all these other points that you're making that would really show Kim. So what's your reaction to that? To the first point that I don't think you've really addressed our anxiety and our concerns about first use, and have you thought about creative ways in which you could do that within this framework?
Okay, well, I think in responding to the second first, I believe that some kind of occupation of that sort would be possible, but I do think that this kind of framework, specifically with the web of relations, this kind of interregional trust and diplomacy needs to be established before anything like that is possible. I do not believe that at this point, given the tensions militarily, economically, and regionally, that North Korea would agree to that kind of agreement right off the bat. I think that we would have to establish some kind of stable relations with them in all three of those areas before that would be possible. And in terms of our allies, I would turn that question over to you, Chandler.
Oh, I feel one other issue I was kind of wondering with your proposals that for that to work, North Korea would have to be completely honest in terms of saying where all their nuclear stockpiles and arsenals would be, and there's no guarantee that would even happen, even with a joint occupation. And also, even though I feel like it would be very interesting to have a joint occupation in North Korea, I would be afraid, like as I said in my presentation, talking about overextension. So I feel it'd be very helpful to not only have American troops, but also perhaps even have South Korean and perhaps even Japanese troops in North Korea, even though it might lead to fears of talking about encroachment. But I feel like it would help to have our allies there in terms of making sure that they're involved and making sure their security concerns are made known.
So I see your point as far as maybe not knowing all the sites. Remember that we're making an assumption that it is centrally controlled. Kim does make decisions on this. And so any joint occupation of a national command center could potentially address or at least attenuate that risk. And keep in mind that we have used similar, not exactly like this, but if you look at the Kosovo approach, as far as building confidence in the framework, Berlin, even for many, many years, we had a joint occupation. But as far as addressing the security anxieties of the United States, Japan, do you feel that you've done that with your framework?
Well, I feel that in terms of the U.S., for the U.S. specifically and its citizens, the primary interest is creating a framework that makes it the least likely that North Korea will attack the U.S. And I think that for that framework to work, there needs to be a complex web of all of these kind of relations. And so I think that while it may appear indirect, that is actually the best way to reassure North Korea as a means to create a stable system, as a means to prevent conflict with the U.S. And in terms of our allies and their security, I would turn that to you.
I'd like to address your question regarding the first use of nuclear weapons. I think it's important to remember that Kim, although he is a ruthless leader, and that's been very present on a world stage multiple times, he's not an irrational person. In terms of his priorities, he wants the survival of his regime, and that's his number one priority. And knowing that, with our military action of withdrawing troops and rebalancing them, it shows Kim, where troops have been occupying South Korea for decades, that the U.S. security threat, which motivates his development of his nuclear arsenal, is clearly declining, and thus he can kind of back off the gas pedal of development of more nuclear weapons.
So I have a number of questions about your 4-point agreement, but let me start with two big picture questions. The first, and I'll let you answer that first, is what we call a credible commitment problem. Why would we believe that North Korea would actually follow through with this and give the access that you would need and sort of stop all the development that you're suggesting they would actually stop? Why would we believe that, given the track record? In turn, why would they believe us, that we will do what we say we do, given Iran, given Libya? Why would this why would either side be willing to sort of believe that the other side would agree to it and follow through on their agreement?
Well, I think beginning with the first part, North Korea's interest in gaining nuclear weapons, as we've discussed, is primarily for self-defense and deterrence. And so in our view, North Korea does not want to use those weapons and does not want to have to use those weapons. And so I believe that they will want to sign an agreement that makes it possible for them to keep their deterrence without being threatened by the U.S., and I think that they would. I do think that there is a chance, yes, that they would say we don't trust the U.S. at all, and we are not willing to do anything for the U.S., but I think that would go against their primary interests, and I think that would go against their Kim's rationality. I do think that he is a rational actor, and he realizes that that the U.S. position in the region does pose a threat to him, and he wants that threat to be gone, or as gone as possible. And so I think that that is also part of the rationale behind having China do a big part of the verification, is that they generally have had better relations over the past few years, and that also will allow them to feel as though it's not the U.S. encroaching on their security so much as one of their sort of unofficial allies doing that work.
And also regionally, in talking about our idea of a web of relations, is that even if the North Korea decides to opt out of an agreement or not follow through with it, at least we will have, maybe not as a consolation prize, but as something to move forward, a framework with other surrounding countries to build almost as, like I would say, almost a coalition to put more pressure on North Korea in terms of having cooperation and a way to talk about things and issues in the future. So even if North Korea isn't cooperative, we'll at least have other allies and other relationships to go forward about it.
Can I ask a question about the status quo, and maybe this is for Nico in particular. So you guys kind of say that you want to have this, status quo, and it seems like the basis for your policy is whatever North Korea sees as a departure from that status quo, you kind of want to remove that. And so you say Kim's a rational actor, but I guess my question is, should the North Koreans' regime's perceptions about what the status quo is be the basis for a policy? I mean, if you look at North Korean media or the way they talk about the region and U.S. aggression, I mean, things that we think are far below the level of aggression, they treat as like existential threats, at least in terms of their kind of diplomacy and their rhetoric. So I guess my question is, will this policy that you actually lay out that from your perception seems very non-threatening, we're going to redeploy troops, but you say seamlessly could be deployed back at any time, and Kim would know that, and then we're going to send maybe more nuclear submarines to reassure Japan, which could be seen as Kim is threatening. Do you really think that this policy you lay out is going to be perceived by North Korea as now the threat to our regime is off the table, now we're safe? What is your evidence that that's going to be how Kim's going to perceive these moves?
Well, I'd like to restate that the U.S. has been has had troops in South Korea and has occupied South Korea for several decades. And during the entire Kim regime, he has not. There hasn't been a time where there's been like a high rebalance of troops. And I believe that considering Seoul is so close to the demilitarized zone. Taking out a large chunk of those troops, taking out 4,200 of those troops, like I stated, demonstrates and signals to Kim that we are not trying to encroach, trying to cross the demilitarized zone, or even trying to topple his regime in any way, shape, or form. And along with that, I believe that although he could see a rotation of submarines going to Japan as a potential threat and a potential action of U.S. aggression, I think that the overall plan of not only rebalancing troops but also removing THAAD and strengthening the relationships with China shows that the U.S. are not just like Chinodo said, war hungry, but we are willing to negotiate and willing to talk with them.
And to add to that, just briefly, since North Korea does have nuclear weapons of up to 60 in number, we believe that they are in a place where they can sufficiently defend themselves in terms of regional conflict, and they do have the ability to threaten the U.S. So we feel that asking for a freeze on their nuclear program is not just to get them to freeze their program, it is also to ease the security anxiety of our allies, which would and that security anxiety is part of what is fueling the increasing of tensions and thereby increasing this vicious cycle. So part of this is that we are saying, we're moving back a little bit. You guys slow down on this so that we can generally create a more stable region, and we believe that they would be open to that.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Just, and this may be for Chandler, on the freezing stuff. So, saying denuclearization, that's a pretty clear, Schelling-esque focal point. Like, you don't have any nuclear weapons, right? Freezing means whatever you have right now, no more. And that makes sense in theory, but in practice, I think you said very correctly to Professor Gibson's point, we don't really know exactly how many nuclear weapons North Korea has or where they are. I don't know if missiles are part of the deal. Like with the Iran nuclear deal, missiles aren't part of the deal, and that's a big sticking point. So how do you make this freezing policy actually happen in practice? Like, does North Korea have to transparently declare everything that they have and where they are and whatever else? Like, this seems to me to be not that plausible of a step, let alone the monitoring thing, which even though I agree would be a nice thing to have, I just don't see that as being possible at all. So how do you guys deal with this issue?
Oh, talking about a freeze for freeze plan, we will want North Korea to at least be transparent about about their nuclear stockpile, and especially talking about missiles or weapons in general. But one reason too why we talk about we don't want to completely denuclearize is we realize there could be more peaceful uses for nuclear energy that can help develop the Korean economy. But also, we realize that perhaps most of our allies in the region would prefer a denuclearized North Korea. And we feel like a freeze for freeze step, even if it might be just the final step of what our proposal is talking about, it could be a first step of a gradual denuclearization process, especially as we address North Korean security concerns. And even with not knowing exactly all the nuclear weapons in North Korea, even knowing some could help better formulate a military and economic strategy as we go forward. So even if it might not be completely complete, it could at least be better than it is now.
Building on some of these questions here, would you recommend to the president that he do this as an executive action or a treaty? And if it's an executive action, do you have any thoughts on how you bring Congress into this and the American people? And then finally on that, if the president accepts this course of action and he's at a press conference unveiling it, how does he respond to the question as this agreement, what does that mean for the future of the non-proliferation treaty, the efficacy of it, even the viability of it?
So that's my second big picture question is you're basically saying with this that we accept you as a nuclear weapons state. What does that mean for U.S. non-proliferation policy? Does it show the United States as rewarding bad behavior? Not just nuclear weapons development, but nuclear weapons development by a regime that's had a lot of other issues attached to it, and essentially encouraging proliferation and would-be proliferants elsewhere.
I think that's a difficult question, especially on the international stage, in terms of opinion. I do see where other actors could accuse the U.S. of essentially, yes, rewarding bad behavior, but I think the key to this is the U.S. emphasizing that there are no pathways to denuclearization. There is just no possible way that we can get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. And in the interest of protecting our allies and ourselves and even other actors in the region, I believe that we can make the case that this is the best option. In terms of the first part of the question, I personally think that kind of speaks to the idea of the peace agreement between North Korea and South Korea. I think that a treaty would make sense because this web of relations is kind of established upon the idea that all the actors want to create peace with the other actors multilaterally, but also bilaterally. And Chandler, maybe you can speak to that a little bit more.
And also in terms of talking about selling the idea, I also feel like we need to talk about the risk of human life that could come from trying to pursue of denuclearization from North Korea might not be perhaps even that possible to sell to the American public or even Congress in general. And also, too, we have to realize that just the threat of human life that could be to our allies, aka South Korea and Japan, could put holes in the American security blanket all over the world, or security umbrella. Because we have allies all over the world, and to be the idea of saying that we're willing to put our allies in risk just to pursue denuclearization could be just as harmful as proliferation if we think about it long term.
Can I ask a question to Hadika? So on the economic stuff, you know, your guys' policy in general is based on this idea that, okay, we don't want to do this maximum pressure. We want to kind of use these tools of not so much soft power, but kind of economic pressure, diplomacy, etc. But what's built into that is that if that doesn't work, or if North Korea cheats or otherwise, you have to be prepared to do some of that type of stuff. So I guess my question is, you know, is your plan have that built in? Like, what happens if North Korea, you know, defects or cheats or doesn't follow along and still does stuff regarding its nuclear program, which, to be honest, if history is any guide, and I think you guys did a nice job of bringing in some historical precedents, that's probably going to happen. Like, North Korea is probably not going to sign the type of deal you guys are saying and then just follow the letter of the law perfectly. So how does your plan build in the fact that there's probably going to be some cheating, and are you guys willing to then use, you know, military options or other things to try to punish them if they do?
Right. So I think like one of the things that our policy entails is that better cooperation with China, and like we both using the U.S. and China's resources in order to like, track down networks and sanction those, and like to target those key personnel that are involved in helping and assisting North Korea with their nuclear program would be much more easier with the amount of resources that would be at both China and the United States' disposal. Apart from that, North Korea, one of the other key things is that North Korea, as pointed out by both Forrest and Nico earlier, is their key concern is their own survival. And if we are ready to accept the fact that North Korea is a nuclear weapons state and that we are not targeting or we're not pushing back on them to denuclearize, I feel like it would be there is a much greater chance that North Korea would abide by lesser sanctions and more economic engagement because of the benefits that they derive from that than from trying to evade sanctions or finding illicit ways of increasing their nuclear arsenal, because there is a lot of economic pressure, and that economic pressure is what fuels greater insecurity among the Kim regime.
Okay. So you're kind of saying in some ways you're giving them a lot less incentive to cheat because
Right.
you know it's that, so therefore they're going to be less likely to do so. Okay.
Also, I'd like to add on, in the very unlikely situation that they were to cheat and break these sanctions, because of the removal of THAAD from South Korea, that very much eases anxieties within China, especially in Beijing, regarding U.S. encroachment. And because of that strengthening relationship with China, if there ever were to be some sort of break within the sanctions with North Korea, China, we'd be much more friendly with China, and we'd be able to integrate China with any sort of further military action or punishment.
Let me ask a question. Your policy is based on the idea that complete denuclearization is not going to happen. Well, what if I were to tell you that a freeze for freeze isn't going to happen either? Would there be any benefits to still pursuing your policy of ending military exercises? If the goal is to end North Korea's anxieties, wouldn't it be better for us to move away from military exercises, maybe even continue to withdraw troops? In other words, maybe those policies have benefits even if they're not willing to engage in a freeze. Did you guys think about that scenario?
Yeah, we definitely thought about that. In terms in the situation that a freeze for freeze is also impossible, I think just having these relationships and because these military actions are favorable not only to our allies in the region, South Korea and Japan, but also bring China on our side in this situation and with regarding North Korea. I believe just having the web of relations in the militarily allows for any future situation in the Asia Pacific region regarding North Korea, or potentially not regarding North Korea, to be much more easily it allows the U.S. to easily navigate it in the future.
Just to be clear, you would end the military exercises and still withdraw the troops, even if you cannot work out an agreement with North Korea? I'd say I'd stand by that because of the vast strengthening of relations it allows within all the surrounding countries as well. Great. We have time for one or two more questions. Perhaps Professor Goddard would like to start.
So I have a question about the broader geopolitical implications of what you're proposing here. You were asked earlier about what this means for the United States allies, and I think you've made a convincing case that the United States still continues to have a strong deterrent posture in Japan. South Korea, not so much. Are you worried at all that in the long term this could actually push South Korea directly into China's orbit, diplomatically, militarily, and economically?
Okay. Oh, one thing we have been talking about is that President Moon Jae-in has publicly tried to reinstate the Sunshine Policy, and while a lot of people view the Sunshine Policy as being very dovish in terms of offering concessions towards North Korea, people ignore one key aspect of it, which is that South Korea should be able to have the military forces to be able to respond to North Korean aggression. For example, in 1999 and 2002, when North Korean Navy went past a certain line, the South Korean government responded very harshly in terms of there was loss of life on the North Korean side. So therefore, when we talk about South Korea, we feel as if South Korea could be able to take more initiative in terms of not only establishing more diplomatic and economic ties, but also is building up their own defense, whether that be through spending more of the GDP on their military or focusing on retraining their military and focusing on what ways will be the most strategic to defend the southern half of the peninsula as a whole.
Yeah, so a lot of your project rests upon this web of relations concept, which as I understand it is that multilateral cooperation is a lot easier if we have stronger bilateral relationships between all the 5 countries that you mentioned. How much power does the United States actually have? What concrete policy mechanisms can we use to make it so that, for example, China and South Korea have a stronger bilateral relationship, Japan and North Korea? And if it's true that these countries want it, why hasn't it already happened? What are you going to do with your policy to actually bring that into reality?
Well, one idea we did have, especially with our allies, South Korea and Japan, is having annual summits so they can discuss military strategy and also diplomatic aspects, especially considering that we're talking about relocating troops from South Korea to Japan. So therefore, it will be very important for them to coordinate military strategy and ideas for the future. And also, we feel that, in general, that when we talk about moving towards South Korea going towards having better bilateral relationships with China, or that might be so the case with Japan, that's happened before, but they've also reversed in general. Because considering when we implemented THAAD in South Korea, PRC and South Korean relations deteriorated very quickly. And that actually hurt the South Korean economy. It actually hurt our relationship with the South Korean public in general. So we felt actually having better relations with China might not actually put them under the sway, but also actually have a better effect on our relationship as well.
Just to add to that, the first trilateral talk between South Korea, Japan, and China actually happened this year since 2015. They were not happening due to tensions between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands, but they have occurred again this year, and that, I believe, is evidence that those tensions have taken the back seat to security concerns and have allowed these actors to realize that they need to communicate and that it is in their best security interest to communicate. And I think that will, through that, we can establish a lasting framework.
Okay. Would Team B like to pose any questions to Team A?
Yes, I have a quick question.
Team A will then respond.
So if you implement this freeze for freeze policy and North Korea gets to keep their weapons, I know we touched on this a little bit before, but what kind of precedent does this send for the rest, for any other country that would like to acquire nuclear weapons? Well, tomorrow Myanmar is able to build the weapons from technology that they gained in North Korea. will they also engage in similar discussions with the U.S. about having them also be a nuclear state? Like, what is the future of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty? I know that we talked a bit about this in terms of our classes, about perhaps that the NPT has to be revised to fit more modern day concerns. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this.
I do not believe that this sets a precedent that will change the current state of affairs. I mean, you can look to the Iran deal that happened, and following that, there were not a million new state actors trying to acquire weapons in the hope that they could come to some deal and get some benefits from the U.S. Similarly, I do not believe that there are actors who are prepared to gain nuclear weapons but are waiting to see whether or not the U.S. will attack North Korea. I believe that if they were interested in that, they would pursue that, and if they were not, then they would not. But I don't think that this rests on this one specific case. And I mean, I think also if you look to the Iran deal, you can see how if the U.S. Is able to set up a stable deterrence against the production of nuclear development, it is more possible for the U.S. to contain that nuclearization and possibly reverse that. Whereas in the case of North Korea, that process was already set into motion before the U.S. was able to get in that. Yeah.
Also, adding on to that, I think that the narrative of North Korea is much different than any other nation trying to pursue nuclear weapons, in the sense of one could take the position looking at our policy saying, oh, well, you open the floodgates to everyone having nuclear weapons, and that and they see that as in a bad connotation, in a bad way, that every nation now will have the potential to destroy every other nation. But the thing is, North Korea has had these intentions, and obviously Kim has threatened the United States, but that's not to say that the future nations that want to acquire nuclear weapons will be in line with that same reasoning.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank both of our teams this morning and our experts.